Okay, so I'm gonna start. So we should give John a lot of time. As you can tell, this is an ad hoc lecture, so I'm actually going to run it a little bit different than I usually do. I normally, I still would preferably, time given, want to break into groups at the end to have a little bit of discussion. But again, since I have notes prepared and it's kind of an ad hoc lecture, I will also be taking questions or objections throughout. So please, if you have any questions or problems throughout, just raise your hand, because again, and I'll call as soon as I'm competent to do so. So a little bit different, and again, I like to break into groups after, but we'll see how it goes. We'll do it live. You go write it, we'll do it live. Okay, so my topic is ethics, especially revolutionary ethics. So I'm going to go over the main three branches of ethics, which are going to be consequentialist, virtue ethics or arete ethics, and then deontological ethics. But of course this is not revolutionary ethics. So I'll also link them to their nearest, as I see it, and again this is a somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation that doesn't necessarily correspond exactly to what it is. But I'm also going to link them to their revolutionary ethics that follow out of them. So I will be doing consequentialism as linked to social democracy as a quote-unquote revolutionary movement. I will be doing arete ethics as linked to Foucault initially, and then Antonio Negri's empire, the ethics found in that, the biopolitical ethics. And then I will be doing deontological ethics primarily through Kant. And then I will be, time permitting and competency permitting, going through Alain Badiou's ethics of being and the revolutionary ethics that follow out of that. So that's sort of the game plan. I'm going to start with what I see as the worst form of ethics and the least revolutionary form of ethics, which is consequentialism. So consequentialism is actually very broad field of ethics, of which utilitarianism, which most people are familiar with, is just a small aspect. So consequentialism is basically, as its name implies, concerned with the consequences of one's actions. Now, utilitarianism is the easiest form of consequentialism to understand. This is posed by John Stuart Mill, who is an avowed socialist. However much we want to accept that as actually the case is up in the air. But he self-identifies as a socialist of a variety. So what is utilitarianism, which will give us a good understanding of what consequentialism looks like, and so we can apply it to consequentialism in general? Well, utilitarian ethics basically judge happiness or pleasure. And this goes by the name utility. Right? So you have utility insofar as you have pleasure, you have disutility insofar as you have pain or displeasure, right? So the basic thesis of utilitarianism is that what is ethical or moral is, of course, the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, right? This would make it's pretty commonsensical. There's not, you know, some hidden subtext. If you view pleasure as the best and highest good and displeasure as the worst sort of good, then you would want, again, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Now, there's all sorts of ways of measuring this, and Mill, in fact, notes that the pleasure of, I don't know, eating a sundae or the pleasure of having sex is a pleasure and should be counted. But there are higher pleasures. For example, reading philosophy, or playing music, or painting, or having friends and family who care for you. These sorts of things, of course, would be a higher good. So the one objection to utilitarianism is that, you know, all it wants to do is make us animals, is really poorly founded. Again, the higher pleasures would always pretty much have preference. As long as you're not murdering people to use their blood for your painting, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. Now, here's the thing, though. You run into certain problems. The most famous objection to consequentialism is this. You have someone who, well, I'll frame it in the American context. You have a black man who is accused of raping and murdering a young white girl in the South. It has to be in the South because that would, never be alleged anywhere else. But in any case, right, so you have this black man who's alleged to rape and murder this young girl. And the population is howling for his blood. And the judge is given evidence, demonstrable evidence, that, as a matter of fact, this man didn't do it. And in fact, the man who did it is a well-respected, let's say, white preacher in the community. And the community will never believe that this black man is innocent, where this upstanding pillar of the community, white preacher, is guilty. And so if you find or discard the evidence as faked or fraud, then there's going to be a massive race riot where numerous black people are going to be killed, numerous white people are going to be killed, and race relations are going to be even further hurt. So in a utilitarian perspective, what should one do then? It becomes quite clear. Many are going to die if you rule this man innocent, whereas if you rule him guilty, then only he dies. And of course, that's unfortunate, but as a good utilitarian, right, the greatest good for the greatest number. Obviously, most of you could probably see why this is problematic. So what happens is recently, last 100 years or so, utilitarianism has become, which is just a measure of pleasure, much more sophisticated. Now, it deserves the name of consequentialism. In this case, you're no longer concerned with pleasure as such, right, or utility as such, but utility and pleasure are merely one sort of good that a society has, right? So if you approach it from this perspective, there are many different goods that a society has. One is rule of law. Now that, for a consequentialist, needn't be the overriding good, but it's a good that needs to be considered against, for example, the individuals who will die. Because if you don't respect rule of law, then it becomes, in a consequentialist perspective, more likely as rule of law becomes less and less important, right, that more and more abuses are going to occur. So, in the long run, right, even though you may have a race riot now, the degradation of the rule of law in the future, right, as a future consequence, is going to be the more pragmatic course of action. Right? So this is the more sophisticated version of consequentialism. And we can list all sorts of goods that people value. Right? Health, pleasure, entertainment, education, sexual freedom, the use of drugs, alcohol, and of course, right, the converse. Any damages caused by these, any disintegrations caused by these, any degradations caused by these. Right? And so this would be a form of weighing public utility. Utility is again just pleasure, qua happiness, public consequences. So how does this play out as a revolutionary theory? Well, it's pretty easily. Social democracy is the way in which consequentialism plays out. If we have a group of people who all have different consequences weighed in different ways, how do we adjudicate where those consequences alter? Well, what we do is we decide democratically. Now, this does, in a certain sort of way, lend itself to a certain sort of anti-capitalism. Because as a matter of fact, under corporate capitalism, for example, capitalist lobbyists can lobby for corporations that experience no real pleasure, although they might have consequences of some variety. For example, we might have a consequence of how the economy is doing or something like that. But as a matter of fact, most of us are very hurt by capitalism, both here in America and in the world, right? So, of course, we would want to change this. Well, how would a social democrat do so? Well, through the weighing of democratic processes. You would elect candidates who weren't corrupt, you would recall the ones that are, and you would gradually transition from socialism, or Freudian slip there, from capitalism to socialism.